The history books won't tell you about the night of November 14th, 1874. They won't tell you why 300 Navajo warriors stood silently outside a widow's barn, holding torches that turned the night into day. Everyone in the town of Blackwood Creek thought Sarah Miller was going to die that night. They thought the savages had come for scalps. They were wrong. When the tribal chief stepped forward, he didn't pull a weapon. He knelt. But to understand why, and to understand the bloody vengeance that followed for the corrupt sheriff who tried to intervene, you have to go back to the moment Sarah found something shivering in the snow. This is the story they tried to erase. The wind howling through the Chusca Mountains didn't just chill the bone, it carried the voices of the dead. Or at least, that's what Sarah Miller told herself to keep from going mad. It was late afternoon on a Tuesday, but the sky was already a bruised purple, threatening a storm that would bury the Arizona Territory under 3 feet of white death. Sarah, a woman of 40, with hands roughened by labor and eyes hardened by grief, was securing the latch on her barn. She was alone. She had been alone for 2 years, ever since her husband, Elias, had been kicked in the head by a spooked mare, leaving her with 40 acres of rocky soil and a silence so loud it sometimes woke her in the middle of the night. She was just turning back toward the cabin, clutching her shawl tight against her throat, when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too desperate. It was a sound no woman, especially a childless one like Sarah, could ever mistake. A cry. Sarah froze, her boots crunching into the frosted mud. She looked toward the tree line, where the dense pine forest bordered her land. The settlers of Blackwood Creek, 5 miles down the road, called those woods the Devil's Throat. They said it was where the Navajo, the Diné, hid, plotting to take back the land the government had stolen. "Is someone there?" Sarah called out, her hand instinctively moving to the Colt Navy revolver holstered at her hip. No answer, just the wind, and then that sharp, piercing wail again. It was coming from behind the water trough near the old split-rail fence. Sarah didn't run. You didn't run in this country unless you wanted to die. She walked with purpose, the gun heavy on her hip, her breath misting in the freezing air. When she rounded the trough, the gun dropped from her hand. Lying in the dirt, half covered by drifted snow, was a bundle wrapped in a rough woven blanket. The pattern was unmistakable, bold reds and blacks, zigzagging like lightning. It was Navajo work. Sarah fell to her knees, ignoring the biting cold soaking through her skirts. She pulled the blanket back. The child was blue-lipped, his skin terrified and pale, eyes squeezed shut against the cold. He couldn't have been more than 6 months old. He was starving. His cheeks were sunken, his ribs visible even through the swaddling. "Oh, sweet Lord," Sarah whispered, scooping the bundle up. The baby was ice cold. She looked around wildly. Where was the mother? Navajo women were fiercely protective. They did not abandon their children. Sarah scanned the tree line. There, near the edge of the forest, she saw drag marks in the snow. A trail of blood led away from the fence and disappeared into the deep woods. Someone had been hurt, badly. They had likely used the last of their strength to place the child here, near a source of heat and life, before crawling away to die or be captured. Sarah knew the law of the territory. General Order Number 11. Any settler found harboring hostiles was subject to arrest, and any property used to aid them could be seized by the sheriff. And the sheriff of Blackwood Creek, a man named Silas Thorne, didn't need a reason to seize property. He had been eyeing Sarah's land for the water rights for years. If she took this baby in, she was risking her life. If Thorne found out, he wouldn't just arrest her. He would hang her as a traitor to the territory. The baby whimpered, the sound weak and fading. The spark of life was flickering out. Sarah looked at the darkening sky, then down at the innocent face. She thought of her own empty cradle, dusty in the attic. Not tonight, she hissed at the storm. Death don't get this one tonight. She tucked the baby inside her heavy wool coat, pressing him against the warmth of her chest, and ran for the cabin. She bolted the heavy oak door, dropped the locking bar, and closed the shutters. That night, while the blizzard raged outside, Sarah Miller became a mother. She warmed goat's milk by the fire, feeding the child drop by drop with a rag. She warmed him with her own body heat. She named him Samuel because she had asked God for a reason to live, and he had heard her. But as she rocked him by the dying embers of the fire, Sarah didn't know that eyes had been watching her from the ridge, and she didn't know that in town, Sheriff Silas Thorne had just received a report about a wounded Navajo woman found dead 2 miles from the Miller farm. A woman who had been carrying a child that was now missing. The clock was ticking. 3 days passed. The blizzard had trapped Sarah in the cabin, which was a blessing in disguise. It gave little Samuel time to regain his color. He was a fighter. By the 2nd day, he was taking milk greedily. By the 3rd, he let out a laugh that sounded like cracking ice melting in the spring, pure and startling. But the snow was melting, and the road to Blackwood Creek was opening up. Sarah was low on flour and lamp oil. She had no choice. She had to go into town. She created a hiding place first. Beneath the floorboards of the pantry, there was a root cellar. She set up a warm nest of blankets there. "You stay quiet, little one," she whispered, kissing Samuel's forehead. He stared up at her with dark, intelligent eyes, as if he understood the stakes. She saddled her mare, Bess, and rode out. The town of Blackwood Creek was a scar on the landscape, a collection of hastily built wooden structures, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and urine, and a jailhouse built of stone. As Sarah hitched Bess in front of the general store, she felt the eyes on her. The town was on edge. Rumors of a Navajo uprising were swirling. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," the shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, said as she entered. He didn't smile. "Haven't seen you since the storm. Survive all right?" "Just fine, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "Just need 50 pounds of flour and a tin of oil." "Hear about the excitement?" Henderson asked, leaning over the counter. He had a way of gossiping that felt like an interrogation. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Excitement?" "Sheriff's boys found a squaw dead in the woods near your property line," Henderson said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "She was the daughter of a big chief, they think. Chief Red Cloud. Rumor is she was carrying a baby. Sheriff Thorne thinks the baby is still out there. Or maybe someone took it." Sarah's hands trembled as she counted out the coins. "Is that so? Probably died in the cold." "Maybe," a deep voice boomed from the doorway. Sarah froze. She turned to see Sheriff Silas Thorne filling the frame. Thorne was a mountain of a man, with a thick black beard and eyes that looked like chips of flint. He wore a long duster coat, and his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Sheriff?" Sarah nodded, trying to move past him. Thorne didn't move. He blocked her path. "You look nervous, Sarah. You got something to hide?" "I'm a widow living alone, Sheriff." Men blocking my path tend to make me nervous, she shot back. Sarah had a sharp tongue. It was the only thing that kept men like Thorn at bay. Thorn chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Fair enough, but we're searching all the outlying farms. That baby, it's valuable. Valuable? Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. It's a child, Silas, not a stray calf. Thorn stepped closer, towering over her. He smelled of whiskey and gun oil. It's leverage, Sarah. Chief Red Cloud has been hitting our supply wagons. If we have his grandson, we have the chief on a leash. We find that brat, and we control the tribe. A chill went down Sarah's spine, colder than the blizzard. Thorn didn't want to save the baby. He wanted to use Samuel as a hostage, a bargaining chip to break the Navajo resistance. And knowing Thorn, once he had what he wanted, he wouldn't keep a savage mouth to feed for long. Well, Sarah said, forcing a shrug, I haven't seen anything. Just snow and wolves. Is that right? Thorn narrowed his eyes. Then you won't mind if I ride out later today? Just to take a look around. For your safety, of course. I can't stop the law, Sarah said, clutching her flour sack. But don't expect tea and biscuits. She pushed past him and walked to her horse. She didn't run, but every instinct in her body was screaming at her to flee. She felt Thorn's eyes boring into her back as she rode away. She made it 2 miles out of town before she heard it, the thunder of hooves behind her. She risked a glance back. It wasn't Thorn. It was his deputy, a rat-faced man named Cletus, and 2 other hired guns. They weren't coming for a friendly visit. They were riding hard. Thorn hadn't believed her. Sarah kicked Bess into a gallop. Come on, girl, fly. She had to get to the cabin first. She had to get Samuel and run. But where? The mountains were impassable. The town was a trap. As she tore into her own yard, she leaped off the horse before it had even stopped. She burst into the cabin and tore up the floorboards in the pantry. Samuel was sleeping peacefully. She grabbed him, wrapping him in the thickest furs she had. But as she stood up, a shadow fell across the doorway. Going somewhere, Sarah? It was Cletus. He was standing there, a cruel grin on his face, his revolver pointed right at her chest. Behind him, the other 2 men were laughing. Look at that, Cletus sneered, holstering his gun and stepping inside. Thorn was right. You are a traitor, and you got the prize. He reached out his dirty hands toward the baby. Don't touch him, Sarah warned, backing up against the stove. Or what? Cletus laughed. You gonna shoot me? Sarah didn't hesitate. She raised the Colt Navy she had hidden under the baby's blanket and pulled the trigger. Bang! The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Cletus looked down, a look of utter shock on his face as a red bloom spread across his shoulder. He stumbled back, falling out the door. She shot me! The witch shot me! He screamed. The other 2 men drew their weapons, and bullets began to tear through the wood of the cabin walls. Splinters flew like shrapnel. Sarah dove to the floor, shielding Samuel with her body as glass shattered and plates exploded above her head. She was pinned down. 3 men, and Cletus was still screaming, likely alive, against 1 woman and a baby. She had 6 shots left. She crawled toward the back window, hoping to slip out into the cornfield. But when she peeked over the sill, her heart stopped. More riders were coming. A lot of them. A cloud of dust on the horizon. Was it Thorn with reinforcements? She squinted. The riders weren't wearing dusters. They weren't wearing hats. They were riding bareback, painted with clay and ash. It wasn't Thorn. It was the Navajo. Dozens of them. Sarah sank back against the wall, clutching Samuel tight. She was trapped between the corrupt lawmen who wanted to use the baby and the warriors who likely thought she had kidnapped him. "Lord," she whispered into the baby's ear. "I tried." But the shooting from outside suddenly stopped. The deputies weren't firing at the house anymore. They were yelling in panic. "Indians! It's a war party! Ride!" Sarah heard the scramble of horses as Cletus and his men fled, leaving their wounded behind in their haste to escape the approaching army. Silence fell over the farm, a heavy, terrifying silence. Sarah stood up slowly. She walked to the front door, the baby in her arms. She had to face this. If she was going to die, she would die on her feet. She stepped onto the porch. There, lining the ridge of her property, were 50 mounted warriors. In the center sat a man with a face like weathered leather, wearing a headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down to his horse's flank. Chief Red Cloud. He stared at Sarah. Sarah stared back. Then, the chief raised his spear. Sarah flinched, hugging Samuel tighter, but he didn't throw it. He pointed it toward the town of Blackwood Creek. Then he looked back at her, his eyes landing on the bundle in her arms. He didn't look angry. He looked waiting. Sarah realized with a jolt that the danger hadn't passed. It had just changed shape. The tribe hadn't attacked her yet because they saw she was holding the child. But night was falling, and in the distance, she could see the orange glow of torches moving from the direction of the town. Thorn was coming back, and he was bringing the whole town with him. He would tell them Sarah was a traitor, working with the savages to kill deputies. He would turn the mob on her. Sarah Miller was caught in the middle of a war, holding the only thing that mattered to both sides. The silence that fell over the Miller farm was heavier than the snow that still clung to the shadows of the barn. Sarah stood on her porch, the wind whipping her skirts, staring up at the ridge. The 50 warriors hadn't moved. They sat atop their ponies like statues carved from the canyon rock, their silhouettes cut sharp against the dying light of the sun. Chief Red Cloud was at the center, his eyes fixed on the bundle in Sarah's arms. She expected a war cry. She expected arrows to rain down and turn her cabin into a pincushion, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the terrified beating of her own heart. "Why don't you attack?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Slowly, Chief Red Cloud raised a hand. The warriors turned their horses in unison. They didn't descend toward the house. Instead, they melted back into the tree line of the Devil's Throat, disappearing like ghosts. Sarah let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for an hour. They weren't leaving. She knew that much about the Dine. They were watching. They were waiting for nightfall. They knew she was trapped. They knew the sheriff would return, and perhaps they wanted to see if the white woman would hand the child over to the bluecoats, or if she would die protecting him. It was a test. Sarah retreated inside and barred the door. She moved the heavy oak table against it, then dragged the cast iron stove slightly to block the back entrance. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was sharpening. Survival had a way of clearing the fog of fear. She looked down at Samuel. He was awake, his dark eyes tracking the dust motes dancing in a shaft of light. He reached a tiny hand up and grabbed Sarah's finger. "Your trouble, little man," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "The whole territory is about to burn for you." 5 miles away, in the muddy streets of Blackwood Creek, the fire was already being lit, not with wood, but with words. Sheriff Silas Thorne stood on a crate outside the Golden Nugget Saloon. A crowd had gathered. Miners, fur trappers, and shopkeepers. They were good people mostly, but fear makes men ugly, and Thorne was a master at painting fear. Lying on a wagon bed next to him was Deputy Cletus. His shoulder was bandaged, soaked in fresh blood, though the wound wasn't mortal. Thorne had made sure Cletus looked like he was at death's door. "Look at him!" Thorne bellowed, his voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. "Shot down, not by the Navajo, but by one of our own." A murmur of disbelief ran through the crowd. Sarah Miller. Thorne spat the name like a curse. "We went there to warn her. We went there to protect a widow woman from the savages. And what did we find? We found her harboring a Navajo war child. And when my deputy tried to retrieve the babe, to bring it to the safety of the church, she gunned him down in cold blood." "She's gone native," someone shouted from the back. "She's a traitor," another voice cried. Thorne held up his hands. "It's worse than that. The scouts tell me she's been signaling the tribe. She's planning to help Red Cloud coordinate an attack on this very town tonight. That baby is the key. If the savages get that baby back, they have their future chief. If we take it, we break their spirit." He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the men. He saw the fear, the anger, the prejudice. He had them. "I need volunteers," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a growl. "I need men who aren't afraid to do what's right. We ride at sundown, we take the child, and we burn that traitorous nest to the ground." A roar went up from the crowd. Men rushed to their horses, grabbing rifles and shotguns. Torches were dipped in pitch. Bottles of whiskey were passed around to steel nerves. In the chaos, only one man didn't cheer. Old Doc Baker, the town physician, watched from his office window. He knew Sarah Miller. He had delivered her stillborn daughter 5 years ago. He knew she wasn't a traitor. But he also knew that standing against Silas Thorne tonight was a death sentence. He closed his blinds and prayed. Back at the farm, night had fully descended. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, plunging the valley into an abyssal darkness. Sarah sat in the center of the cabin, the Colt Navy reloaded on her lap. She had doused the lantern. Light made you a target. She heard the wolves howling in the distance, but then the howling changed. It wasn't wolves. It was the rumble of thunder. But there were no clouds. She crawled to a knothole in the wall and looked out. The horizon was glowing. A river of orange fire was flowing down the road from Blackwood Creek. Torches, hundreds of them. The mob was coming. Sarah looked at Samuel, sleeping in the root cellar nest she had made. She kissed his head, then replaced the floorboards, covering them with a rug and the heavy rocking chair. "Stay quiet, Samuel," she whispered into the dark. "Mama has to go to work." She stood up, cocked the hammer of the revolver, and waited. The sound of the mob was terrifying. It wasn't the disciplined silence of the Navajo warriors. It was a chaotic cacophony of shouting men, jingling spurs, and the crack of whips. They stopped at the edge of the yard. The torchlight flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows against the cabin walls. It looked like the mouth of hell had opened up on Sarah's doorstep. "Sarah Miller," Thorne's voice boomed out. "Come out with your hands up. Send the brat out first." Sarah didn't answer. She moved silently from window to window, checking her angles. "Have it your way," Thorne yelled. A bottle smashed against the front porch. Then another. The smell of kerosene wafted into the cabin. A flaming torch arched through the air, landing in a puddle of the oil. Whoosh! Flames roared up the front wall of the cabin. The dry wood, seasoned by years of Arizona sun, caught instantly. Inside, the temperature spiked. Smoke began to curl under the door. "Burn her out," a man screamed. "Burn the witch." Sarah coughed, covering her mouth with her shawl. She couldn't stay inside. They would roast her alive. But if she went out, they would hang her. She looked at the floorboards where Samuel was hidden. The fire hadn't reached the pantry yet. If she went out the back, maybe she could draw them away. Maybe she could lead them into the woods and give the baby a chance. It was a suicide mission. But it was the only card she had left. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in the water bucket, and threw it over her head. She kicked the back door open and stumbled out into the freezing night air, coughing violently. "There she is!" came a shout. 3 men were waiting by the barn. They raised their rifles. Sarah fired blindly. One man yelled and clutched his leg. The others ducked. Sarah ran. She ran toward the open field, away from the tree line, trying to pull the attention of the entire mob. "Get her!" Thorne screamed from the front of the house. "Don't shoot to kill yet. I want to know where the baby is." Sarah's lungs burned. Her boots slipped in the mud. She made it 50 yards before a lasso tightened around her shoulders. With a brutal yank, she was pulled off her feet. She slammed into the hard earth, the air driven from her body. She was dragged through the mud, gasping, until she was hauled up by 2 rough-looking miners. Thorne walked over to her, the fire from her burning home reflecting in his cold eyes. He backhanded her across the face. Sarah tasted blood. "Where is it?" Thorne hissed, grabbing her by the hair. "Where is the half-breed?" "Go to hell, Silas," Sarah spat, blood staining her teeth. Thorne smiled grimly. "I'm already there, darling, and I'm the king." He turned to the men. "Check the house. If the baby's in there, get it before the roof collapses." "No!" Sarah screamed, struggling against her captors. The men laughed. One of them pulled a knife. "Maybe we cut a finger off for every minute she don't talk." Thorne nodded. "Start with the thumb." The man grabbed Sarah's hand. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the pain. But the knife never touched her skin. A sound cut through the jeering of the mob. It was a sound so deep, so primal, it vibrated in the chests of every man present. Thrum, 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 drums. The mob fell silent. The fire crackled, consuming the Miller porch, but the men stopped watching it. They turned toward the darkness beyond the barn. From the blackness of the night, a light appeared, then another, and another. It wasn't the chaotic, smoky yellow flame of the mob's pitch torches. These were bright, clean flames, torches made of resin-soaked pine. One by one, they ignited in a perfect circle. Sarah gasped. The lights weren't just coming from the woods. They were coming from everywhere. A massive ring of fire had ignited, completely surrounding the mob, the burning house, and Sarah. The Navajo had arrived. But they weren't just 50 warriors this time. The ring of torches revealed hundreds of them. They stood 3 deep, their faces painted in the colors of war, black for death, red for blood. The mob of 50 townsmen, who felt so brave moments ago, suddenly looked very small. They huddled together, their guns pointing outward in shaky hands. "Steady," Thorne yelled, though his voice cracked. "They won't attack. We have the woman. Use her as a shield." The man holding Sarah tightened his grip, pulling her in front of him. From the line of Navajo warriors, a gap opened. A single horse walked forward. It was a magnificent white stallion. On its back sat Chief Red Cloud. He held no weapon. His hands were empty. He rode calmly toward the mob, ignoring the 50 rifles pointed at his chest. He stopped 10 feet from Thorn. The chief looked at the burning house, then at Sarah, who was bleeding and covered in mud. Finally, he looked at Thorn. "You trespass," Red Cloud said. His English was broken, heavily accented, but deep and resonant. "This is government land," Thorn shouted, trying to regain control. "And that woman is a criminal. She kidnapped your grandson." It was a desperate lie, a gamble. Thorn hoped to turn the chief against Sarah. Red Cloud turned his gaze to Sarah. His dark eyes bored into hers. He saw the blood on her face. He saw the terror. But he also saw something else, the fierceness of a mother whose nest was being threatened. He looked at the burning cabin. Then he pointed a weathered finger at the house. "Where is child?" Red Cloud asked Sarah. "Inside," Sarah choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Under the floor. He's safe from the fire, for now." Thorn laughed. "See? She hit him. She stole him." Red Cloud looked back at Thorn. A slow, terrifying smile spread across the chief's face. It wasn't a smile of humor. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped rabbit. "She hit him," Red Cloud said softly. "From you." He raised his hand. Suddenly, a dozen young Navajo warriors sprinted from the line. They didn't run at the mob. They ran past them, straight into the burning cabin. "Stop them!" Thorn yelled. "Shoot them!" "No fire!" Red Cloud roared, his voice like thunder. "First man to shoot dies." The threat hung in the air. The archers in the front row of the Navajo line drew their bows back. The sound of hundreds of bowstrings tightening was louder than a gunshot. Not a single man in the mob dared to pull a trigger. The young warriors disappeared into the smoke. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The roof groaned. Sparks flew into the night sky. Moments later, a warrior emerged from the smoke. He was coughing, his skin soot-stained, but in his arms, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, was Samuel. The baby let out a loud, indignant wail. A collective sigh seemed to go through the Navajo line. The chief's shoulders relaxed. The warrior brought the baby to Red Cloud. The chief took the bundle, looking down at the face of his grandson. He touched the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. Then he handed the baby back to the warrior and turned to Sarah. "Let her go," Red Cloud commanded. The man holding Sarah looked at Thorn. Thorn was sweating, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. He was surrounded by 300 warriors. His lie had been exposed. "She killed my deputy." Thorn tried one last time. "She protected my blood," Red Cloud countered. "Tonight, she is Diné. You hold a daughter of the tribe." The warriors took a synchronized step forward. The torches illuminated the tips of their spears. The man holding Sarah shoved her away as if she were on fire. Sarah stumbled forward, falling to her knees near the chief's horse. Red Cloud looked down at her. "Stand, Sarah Miller. The fire is warm, but the justice will be cold." He gestured to his warriors. "Take their horses. Take their guns. Leave them their boots. They have a long walk home." "You can't do this," Thorn screamed. "I am the law." "Not here," Red Cloud said. "Tonight, I am the law." As the warriors moved in to disarm the terrified mob, Thorn reached for the pistol hidden in his boot. It was a cowardly move, a last-ditch effort to kill the chief and cause chaos. Sarah saw it. She was on her knees, but her hand found a rock in the mud. But she didn't need it. From the darkness behind the barn, a single arrow whistled through the air. It struck Thorn's hand just as he drew the gun, pinning his palm to his own thigh. Thorn screamed, dropping to the ground. Red Cloud didn't even flinch. He looked past the mob, toward the darkness where the arrow had come from. A lone figure stepped out. It was a woman. She was limping, holding her side, her face pale but fierce. Sarah gasped. It was the mother. The woman Thorne said was dead. She hadn't died in the woods. She had crawled back to her people. She had told them everything. She had told them Sarah had saved the baby, not stolen it. That was why the tribe hadn't attacked earlier. They knew. The torch night wasn't a siege. It was a rescue mission. And Sarah Miller had just been adopted. The sun rose over a scene of devastation, but also of strange, silent victory. The Miller cabin was nothing but a smoldering heap of ash and blackened timber. The chimney stood alone, a jagged stone finger pointing at the sky, accusing the men who had done this. But Sarah Miller was alive. She sat on a log near the edge of the woods, a heavy buffalo robe draped over her shoulders. A gift from the woman she now knew as Nita, the daughter of Chief Red Cloud. Nita sat beside her side bandaged with fresh herbs and linen. The two women didn't speak the same language fluently, but they spoke the language of mothers. Nita held Samuel, nursing him, while Sarah watched. The mob was gone. Sheriff Thorne and his 50 deputies had been stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their dignity. Chief Red Cloud had kept his word. He didn't kill them. He did something worse for men like Thorne. He humiliated them. He forced them to walk the 5 miles back to Blackwood Creek in the freezing mud, while Navajo outriders herded them like cattle, yipping and firing arrows at their heels whenever they slowed down. Thorne, clutching his hand where the arrow had pierced it, had looked back at Sarah one last time before he was marched away. The look in his eyes wasn't just hate anymore. It was a promise of total annihilation. He was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were the most dangerous kind. "You cannot stay here," Nita said, her English halting but clear. She nodded toward the ruins of the cabin. "Thorne. He is Snake. He will bite again." Sarah looked at the ashes of her life. "I have nowhere to go, Nita. This land is all I have." "Come to mountains," Nita offered. "Tribe will protect." Sarah shook her head slowly. "If I run, I'm a fugitive forever. I'm a criminal in the eyes of my own people. I have to face this. I have to clear my name." Red Cloud rode up then, looking down at the two women. He understood Sarah's refusal. He respected strength. "We watch," the chief said. "If Snake strikes, we strike." The tribe left an hour later, disappearing into the devil's throat like mist. They left Sarah a horse, a rifle, and a pouch of dried meat. But they took Samuel. It was the only way. The baby belonged with his mother, and Sarah knew that as long as the baby was with her, Thorne would hunt them both down. Saying goodbye to the child she had saved from the snow broke Sarah's heart more than the burning of her home. She kissed his forehead one last time. "Live, little one. Grow strong." Sarah rode into Blackwood Creek at noon. She didn't sneak in. She rode right down the main street, her head high, despite the soot on her face and the exhaustion in her bones. The town was quiet. The men who had been part of the mob were hiding in their homes, nursing blistered feet and bruised egos. But as she reached the sheriff's office, the door flew open. Thorne wasn't there. Instead, it was a man Sarah didn't recognize, a man in a clean gray suit with a silver star on his chest that was polished to a mirror shine. He was flanked by 4 deputies, armed with Winchester repeating rifles. "Sarah Miller?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, cultivated. He didn't sound like a rough frontier lawman. He sounded like a politician. "I am," Sarah said, dismounting. I've come to file a complaint against Sheriff Thorne for arson and attempted murder." The man smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "I'm afraid Sheriff Thorne has beaten you to the punch, Mrs. Miller. I am Marshal Darius P. Collins from the territorial capital. I've been sent to restore order." "Then arrest Thorne," Sarah said, pointing to the jailhouse. "He burned my home. He led a lynch mob." "According to the sworn affidavits of 50 witnesses," Marshal Collins said, pulling a paper from his pocket, "Sheriff Thorne led a posse to rescue a kidnapped white woman from a hostile uprising. You, Sarah Miller, are charged with treason, incitement of insurrection, and the attempted murder of a law officer." Sarah stared at him. "Kidnapped white woman? I was the one being attacked." "That's not what the report says," Collins said, snapping his fingers. The deputies moved in. They grabbed Sarah roughly, pulling her arms behind her back. The click of iron handcuffs was the only sound in the street. "This is a lie," Sarah screamed as they dragged her toward the jail. "Thorne is a liar." Thorne stepped out of the shadows of the alleyway then. His hand was heavily bandaged, held in a sling. He looked pale and feverish, but his grin was triumphant. "Save it for the judge, Sarah," Thorne whispered as she was hauled past him. "Judge Ezekiel Stone is presiding next week. You know him? They call him the hangman." Sarah was thrown into a cell. It was cold, damp, and smelled of rot. She was alone. The tribe was in the mountains. Her baby was gone. Her home was gone. And now, the law itself had been weaponized against her. But Sarah Miller didn't cry. She sat on the cot, listening to the jeers of the deputies outside. She remembered the look in Red Cloud's eyes. She remembered the weight of the Colt Navy in her hand. "You should have killed me when you had the chance, Silas," she whispered to the stone walls. The trial of Sarah Miller was the biggest event the Arizona Territory had seen in a decade. It wasn't held in the small Blackwood Creek courthouse. It was moved to the county seat in Prescott, ostensibly for security reasons, but really so Thorne and Collins could put on a show. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from as far away as San Francisco were there, their pencils scratching furiously on notepads. The narrative Thorne had spun was sensational. The White Witch of Blackwood Creek, a woman who had turned her back on her race to become the queen of the savages. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, wearing a plain gray dress provided by the jail. She refused to look down. She scanned the crowd. The jury was composed entirely of men, miners, ranchers, and merchants. Not a single one looked friendly. At the prosecutor's table sat Marshal Collins. He wasn't just a lawman. He was a lawyer by trade, a man with political ambitions who saw hanging Sarah Miller as his ticket to the governor's mansion. And on the bench sat Judge Ezekiel Stone. He was a skeletal man with a white beard and eyes that looked like they had seen hell and enjoyed the view. He didn't use a gavel. He used the butt of a revolver to silence the room. "This court is now in session," Stone rasped. "The Territory versus Sarah Miller. Charges: treason, kidnapping, and attempted murder." The trial was a farce from the opening statement. Collins painted Sarah as a monster. He called Deputy Cletus to the stand. Cletus, his arm in a sling, wept fake tears as he described how Sarah had lured him into the cabin and shot him while he was trying to deliver milk to a starving widow. "She was speaking their language, Your Honor." Cletus lied, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "She was chanting, calling down the devil." The jury gasped. The reporters scribbled faster. Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man named Mr. Abernathy who smelled of gin, barely objected. He was terrified of Judge Stone. Then came Thorne. He took the stand, looking like a war hero. He described the night of the torches not as a rescue, but as an ambush set by Sarah. She signaled them, Thorne said, looking solemnly at the jury. We saw her waving a lantern. She commanded them to attack us. It was only by the grace of God and the discipline of my men that we survived without a massacre. And the baby? Collins asked. The Navajo child? There was no baby. Thorne lied smoothly. That was a cover story she invented. She was harboring a war chief. We saw him escape into the woods. Sarah stood up, slamming her hands on the table. You liar! You soulless liar! You wanted to use that baby as a hostage. Sit down, woman, Judge Stone roared, banging his gun on the bench. One more outburst, and I will have you gagged. Sarah sank back into her chair. It was hopeless. The truth didn't matter here. The story was already written. For 2 days, the parade of lies continued. Sarah was allowed to testify, but Collins twisted her every word. When she spoke of finding the baby, he asked why she hadn't reported it immediately. When she spoke of the mother, he asked for proof the woman existed. I have no proof, Sarah said quietly. Only my word. And the word of a traitor, Collins sneered, is worth less than the dirt on my boot. It was the 3rd day. Closing arguments were about to begin. The mood in the room was bloodthirsty. The crowd was taking bets on when Sarah would hang. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud crash. The room fell silent. Judge Stone glared over his spectacles. Who dares interrupt my court? A man stepped into the aisle. He was tall, wearing a dusty travel coat. He wasn't a local. He walked with a strange, rhythmic limp, tapping a cane made of black walnut against the floor. He wore a hat pulled low, shadowing his face. I dare, the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. 2 deputies moved to block him. Get out of here, mister. Court is closed. The man didn't stop. He reached into his coat. The deputies went for their guns. Hold, the man barked. He pulled out a document wrapped in oilskin. He bypassed the deputies and walked straight to the bench, tossing the document onto Judge Stone's desk. What is this? Stone demanded, picking it up. Read it, the stranger said. He turned to face the room. He took off his hat. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with a scar running down his cheek and steel gray hair. But it was his eyes that made Thorne, sitting in the front row, turn pale. They were the eyes of a man who hunted predators. My name, the stranger announced to the silent room, is Elias Vance. I am a senior inspector for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, reporting directly to the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Federal agents rarely came out this far. And I am here, Vance continued, pointing his cane at Thorne, because 3 months ago, I received a letter detailing the systematic theft of water rights, the embezzlement of territorial funds, and the illegal provocation of the Navajo Nation for the purpose of seizing land. Thorne stood up, sweat breaking out on his forehead. This is out of order. Who wrote this letter? Vance turned his gaze to Sarah. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Her husband did, Vance said. Elias Miller, 2 weeks before he died. The courtroom erupted. Sarah gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Her husband? Elias had written to Washington? She never knew. Elias Miller was a patriot, Vance's voice cut through the noise. He suspected Sheriff Thorne was murdering settlers to blame it on the tribes, driving land prices down so he and his cronies could buy it up. We've been investigating Thorne for a year. This is preposterous, Collins shouted, though he looked ready to vomit. You have no jurisdiction here. I don't, Vance agreed. But he does. Vance gestured to the open doors. Walking in was not a lawyer. It was a captain of the United States Cavalry, in full dress uniform, his saber rattling at his side. Behind him marched 12 soldiers, armed with rifles. And walking beside the captain, wearing a suit of buckskin, but holding his head with the regal bearing of a king, was Chief Red Cloud. The crowd screamed. People scrambled back, climbing over benches to get away from the savage. Order! Judge Stone banged his gun, but his hand was shaking. The cavalry captain stepped forward. Judge Stone, I am Captain Harris. I am placing this court under martial law by order of General Sherman. We have testimony regarding the events of November 14th. Testimony from who? Stone stammered. From an Indian? Red Cloud stepped up to the witness stand. He didn't sit. He stood. He looked at the jury, then at Thorne. I speak, Red Cloud said. His voice was deep, filling the room. I speak for the woman who gave my grandson life. I speak for the woman who stood against fire. He reached into his tunic and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it and held it up. It was a sheriff's badge, but it wasn't Thorne's. It was old, rusted, and stained with blood. This, Red Cloud said, was found on the body of my daughter, the mother of the child. He threw the badge at Thorne's feet. It clattered on the floor, spinning to a stop. Thorne stared at it. The room went deathly silent. Everyone recognized the badge. It belonged to Deputy Cletus, the man who had sworn on the Bible that he was delivering milk. My daughter was not dead when she crawled home, Red Cloud said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. She lived long enough to speak. She said the Star Man shot her. She said he laughed when he took the babe. Red Cloud pointed a finger at Cletus, who was shrinking into his seat in the back. He is the murderer, and he, Red Cloud pointed at Thorne, is the one who gave the order. Inspector Vance stepped forward again. We have the witness, Your Honor. We have the motive. And now, thanks to the stupidity of Mr. Thorne keeping the badge as a souvenir on his deputy, we have the evidence. Vance looked at Sarah. Sarah Miller is not on trial here, gentlemen. You are. Thorne looked at the doors, blocked by soldiers. He looked at the window. Too high. He looked at the crowd. They weren't looking at Sarah with hate anymore. They were looking at him. And they looked hungry. The tables had turned. The karma wasn't just instant. It was catastrophic. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The rusted, blood-stained badge lay on the floor like a burning coal, unraveling Sheriff Thorne's web of lies in an instant. Is this true? Judge Stone rasped, looking from the badge to Thorne. Did your deputy kill that woman? Thorne's face turned a violent shade of purple. It's a trick. Since when do we trust savages over the law? Since the law became a murderer. Sarah stood up, her voice ringing clear. You didn't just kill that woman. You killed my husband, Elias, didn't you? He found out about your land schemes, so you silenced him. Before Thorne could scream another denial, Deputy Cletus broke. The rat-faced man, terrified by the cavalry soldiers and the looming presence of the chief, pointed a shaking finger at his boss. He made me do it, Cletus shrieked. Thorne ordered the hit. He said if we killed the chief's daughter, we could start a war and take the valley. He promised me the Miller farm. The courtroom erupted. Captain Harris signaled his men. Sheriff Thorne, you are under arrest. Thorne's eyes darted around like a trapped animal. He saw the hate in the townspeople's eyes. The men he had fooled were now looking at him with hungry rage. He snapped. With desperate speed, Thorne lunged at Marshal Collins, snatching a small derringer from the lawyer's belt and jamming it into his temple. "Back off!" he screamed, dragging the terrified marshal toward the judge's chambers. "I'm walking out of here. Anyone follows, Collins dies." He shoved the marshal to the floor and kicked open the back door, bursting into the blinding sunlight of the alleyway. He was free. He just needed a horse. He sprinted toward the end of the alley, his heart pounding, but he didn't make it. Blocking the exit, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, were 20 Navajo warriors. They held no guns, only heavy war clubs. Thorne skidded to a halt, spinning around, but the courthouse door clicked locked behind him. He looked up to see Inspector Vance and Sarah standing on the roof, looking down. "I told you, Silas," Vance called down. "The army guards the front, the tribe guards the back." Thorne raised the tiny pistol at the warriors. "Get back! I am the law!" The warriors parted, and the young father of the baby stepped forward. He didn't strike Thorne. He simply reached out, ripped the silver star from Thorne's vest, and dropped it into the mud. Then the circle closed in. Inside the courthouse, the crowd heard a single terrified scream. Then silence. When the soldiers finally breached the alley, the warriors were gone. Thorne was found lying in the dirt, shattered and broken, stripped to his undergarments. Pinned to his chest with a cactus spine was a scrap of leather with one word written in charcoal: justice. Thorne survived, but only to rot in a territorial prison, a cripple haunted by the sound of drums. Sarah's name was cleared, and the Miller-Vance decree granted her the land forever. 3 months later, as the sun set over the valley, Sarah stood on the porch of her rebuilt cabin. Movement at the tree line caught her eye. Nita rode out, with a cradleboard strapped to her back. She dismounted and handed the bundle to Sarah. Samuel had grown. He was chubby, happy, and gurgling with life. Sarah held him close, tears streaming down her face, united with the mother she had saved. They stood together, a white woman and a Navajo woman, watching the sun dip below the mountains. Peace had returned to Blackwood Creek. And in the end, love had proven stronger than fire. And that is the incredible, true-to-life saga of Sarah Miller, and the night the Wild West changed forever. It's a reminder that history isn't just about gunfights and outlaws. It's about the choices we make when the world turns against us. Sarah chose love over fear, and in doing so, she didn't just save a baby. She brought down a tyrant. Sheriff Thorne thought he was the law, but he forgot the oldest law of the frontier. You reap what you sow. The instant karma he faced wasn't magic. It was the inevitable result of a community and a mother finally standing up to say, no more. If this story gave you chills, or if you think Sarah Miller is a true hero, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these lost stories. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next dive into the untold history of the Wild West. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.